Uh, my first question is, how did the colonial administrators and ethnographers define the idea of caste? To what extent did it differ from the indigenous understanding of caste?
Well, once the British set their feet on the soil, it was a very different social framework that they were encountering, and one of the parameters through which Indian society was was defined at that length of time, or also came to be understood by the British, was caste or the jati system, and we find that in in very different parts of India, it were they had very different ideas about what actually caste was and who were the people who were placed at the top and who were the people who were placed at the bottom. But nonetheless, it was by the late years of the 18th century and more so by the early years of the 19th century, we find that they were using native pandits and people who were very distinguished in Sanskrit or in logical studies, as it came to be defined later. And these were the people who were acting as advisors to the colonial officials. And most of the early colonial sociology was itself a sort of a didactic, based on a didactic understanding of what the native pandits or these interlopers, native interlopers had, or the interlopers had to offer. And we get a very different idea of caste as it came out in the manuals, as it came out in the glossaries, as it came out later, much later in the census reports of 1871-72. But this is not to say that we did not have census before, prior to 1871. Yes, there were small-scale census. They were not as big and or as large in terms of a project that the census came to be defined later. But nonetheless, there are also, you have these enumerations, you have these classifications, and so on and so forth. But once these glossaries, manuals, census came into force, and you see a society, that society is very much, it's right from the apex to the bottom. You find that all caste groups are lined up, and very distinct layers are being created. Now, this has got really no leeway or scope for much of elevation of individuals, of trying to elevate to the upper layers. It looks to be a very watertight compartment. That element of fluidity that was there prior to the to the British conquest of India, or even that had existed, even in the early half of the 18th century. That particular caste system, despite its rigidities, despite the sort of hierarchical structures, it had an element of flexibility, and different jati groups could actually think of pushing themselves up the social scale in terms of their occupational changes and so on and so forth. But after 1871-72, if you see the social movement, if you see how much of the degree of the social movement gets very limited. It's not that the social movement is not taking place. It's not that bigger jati groups are not breaking up into sub-jatis and the jati cluster itself is being redefined. But initially, when the British came, there was this element of fluidity, and what you define in terms of purity and pollution in the Munchian sense, and what you see it in terms of the colonial sociology or the colonial ethnographers' perception of purity and pollution, might not have been the same when you have the very nativist or the indigenist version on caste.
The second question is, From when did Indian intellectuals start reflecting on caste as an institution? Was caste a matter of concern during the mid-19th century period of social reforms? Because we see that Vidyasagar or Ram Mohan did not directly address the issue of caste. So,
Yes, this is a very interesting question as to when the Indian intellectuals, started thinking about caste as an institution, whether it is good for the society or whether it is, creating more divisions. It's a sort of a divisive force that seems to wreck the social fabric altogether. This is certainly a product of the response, the Indian response, is particularly a product of a twin set of reactions. One, as we began by discussing the early half of the 19th century, when a whole series of digests and manuals were coming out from the colonial ethnographers, the scholar officials, so as to say, and this response had another, counterpart, and this was the impact of the missionaries, because the missionaries also kept on writing about caste as an institution and how caste itself had been an integral force of a very decadent social system that was actually represented by the rubric of Hinduism. You see it in the writings of Carey, Marshman, Ward to begin with, and a whole, and even people like Bishop Heba and several others in South India. So obviously, when in the early part of the 19th century, when Indian intellectuals who were actually connected more with the Bengal Renaissance, obviously they did not take this issue of caste because the Bengal Renaissance or the Indian Renaissance of this period was actually a sort of a movement, a cultural reawakening that remained confined within the city or within the upper castes, and it certainly did not percolate down to the didn't take into account the social dynamics or the inertia that prevailed at the rural level or localities which were in between even the urban and the rural. So under that particular viewpoint or understanding, it remained Bengal Renaissance or most of the early Bengali or Indian intellectuals of the early part of the 19th century. They were essentially drawn into bigger questions, but they never really took these questions into account. But the situation started changing from 1860s and 1870s because the missionary pressure intensified, and the government officials also kept on writing, and at one length of time we find that the wave of Christian conversions that began right from the 1850s, if one sees the LMS or the CMS pushing their agenda, in different parts of India, we find that certainly there's a sort of a fear, a phobia within a section of the Indian intelligentsia that the Indian society had maladies and all these had to be addressed or even eliminated. And we feel that the first of these very intensified reactions actually come from the Arya Samaj. And the Arya Samaj actually instills all this, and then we also find that several other groups which had nothing to do with religion, they could be in today's parlance, quote unquote, secular bodies like the Prarthana Samaj, several others in India, even the Brahmo Samaj, talking about caste system and its socially inhibiting role. So I think whatever the Indian response is, it is basically a product of the late 19th century, a sort of an aftermath effect of the Bengal Renaissance or the Indian Renaissance. And this actually, the Indian Renaissance, the Indian response gets a further a leap forward. It has a leap forward, where in the later half, or where in the last years of the 19th century, there's a different renaissance altogether, which is actually questioning colonial modernity, on which the very Indian Renaissance is based, and talking of alternative modernity. For example, the Navashudra movement here in Bengal, or if one sees in Kerala, Ayyan Kali's movement, or it was preceded by Narayana Guru's movement, and in Tamil Nadu, Ayathitas and several others. So we find that these people had very different ideas about the caste system, and they found it more reprobate, and it had to be broken down. And here it was a very, very different response altogether when they were trying to talk about the maladies of caste, because they moved even closer to the Christian missionaries. Not all of them, but several people moved closer to the Christian missionaries to understand the Christian mind. And that also, when particularly the quote-unquote the lower caste intellectuals interacted with this entire question of Renaissance modernity and this very destructive role of caste, they were always looking up to the British rule in a very different way, contrary to the way that the upper castes had been defining British rule, because they were seeing it as a providential blessing for the vast multitude of the suffering masses.
So, do you think that the defense of caste by Indian intellectuals like Bankim and Vivekananda in the late 19th century came suddenly in the wake of nationalism? And if so, then how can one explain the absence of caste issues being addressed during the Swadeshi movement?
Well, this is very interesting, because in recent times, both Bankim and Vivekananda's ideas on caste have been analyzed by social historians of contemporary times by exploring into issues of quote-unquote Samaj and Jati. And what actually, because both Bankim and Vivekananda were trying to address in terms of, sometimes in terms of an Indian race, sometimes in terms of a Bengali race, it's not very clear. And they were trying to invoke this idea of Samaj. Is Samaj, it's still not very clear. Does Samaj include all groups, both Jalchal or Jalchal or Antaja Jatis, particularly in the case of Bengal? Or are we products of different Samajas put together, and all these Samajas in a particular length of time come together to be a part of a bigger Samaj, that is the Bengali Samaj? That itself is a big question mark. Both Bankim and Vivekananda tried to say that this has been handed over from the ancient or the olden days, and this had, even if there had been some interpolations in recent times, issues such as untouchability and unapproachability, particularly with which Vivekananda showed much more interest than Bankim, that could be actually eliminated. But caste was one of the ways through which Indian society had survived, and if it remained, it had to remain in the way as in its pristine form, or the way it had been constructed and reconstructed in the past. But it had to make enough room for the abrogation of these impurities which had become associated with it. So certainly this was a sort of a sanitizing project which Vivekananda and Bankim were engaged in, for that matter. Rather, in trying to put up a valiant defense for a Hindu order or a Hindu race, so as to say, or a Bengali race at times, these were deliberately overlooked and said that, even if that existed, divisions based on purity and pollution, it was not alarming to the extent that the British administration or the missionaries or the critiques of the Hindu order were writing in the West. Rather, it was this sort of ordering of society that lent Hinduism its real character. So, it is quite sure that when these intellectuals guide the Indian mind in the post-Bengali Renaissance period, when we have a whole lot of luminaries there, there is virtually absence of caste, and in this entire Bongo Bongo or the Swadeshi movement, caste was really given no importance, and it seemed that only men of blue blood had the right to be the people to champion what was desh or jati to them. So here, caste or jati in the real sense of it being a divisive force, or in terms of social categories, didn't really come into play, and this has been very well explained by historians like Shum Charkar, that how when a procession actually was, a Swadeshi procession was actually making its way in the northern part of the city, particularly in the Beaton Street area. The sweepers of the Calcutta Municipal Corporation, they really got art seeing this procession because it comprised of Hindu Bhadraloks, Bengali Hindu Bhadraloks and Bhadra Mahilas, and they started pelting stones. And this has been interpreted that where do we figure, if one reads Sarkar's assessment here, then obviously it is very clear that they didn't find that they didn't feel that they were being represented in this movement at all, or in this entire regeneration that Swadeshi was trying to do.
The next question is related to the lower caste movements. So do you think that the lower caste movements, which grew from the late 19th century and gained momentum during the initial years of the 20th century, grew as a counter to the apparent silence of Indian intellectuals on caste matters?
Yeah, because carrying forward, because caste reform had only been a sort of a lip service, with the national conference meetings, or even in the later day Indian National Congress sessions, and virtually there was Indian intellectuals who were middle class intellectuals, primarily from upper caste backgrounds, felt that it would die a natural death. Of course, there were the bad sides of the caste, and they felt that inter-community marriage, and particularly because marriage came much later, but they felt that interdining, as supplying them water, giving them the rights to education, at least elementary education. This also is quite hurting, because they really don't talk about secondary or the post-secondary education, which by now had been gaining ascendancy in different provinces of India, as if they were fit enough for elementary education. And till about 1925, you don't see the Congress also taking up this issue of caste and passing resolutions altogether on caste and untouchability. And of course, with the arrival of Gandhi to the scene, we find that Gandhi's message was definitely interpreted very differently by different people in the occupying the different layers of the Indian society. And certainly the sort of mass interest about the very persona of Gandhi and the sort of message that Gandhi was talking about, and this entire emphasis on the rural society, on the jati structure, and so on and so forth, did generate some bit of interest outside the Congress circles, meaning the people who were the very ordinary masses or the semi-literate masses. And sensing, I think, this sort of interest, and that the Congress itself actually had to be blamed for not able to channelize the aspirations of the people, that Gandhi and that the Congress under Gandhi, even though Gandhi was nowhere in the scene after 1922, in the sense that there was a temporary lull period of Gandhi's activities. But in 1925, at the Gaya session of the Indian National Congress, the Congress actually takes up this issue of untouchability in some way or the other. But while this is a sort of a very low-key reaction on the part of the Congress, by this time, of course, the lower caste movements were definitely able to gain advantage, because the Congress, which was claiming to represent the interests of the entire Indian Indian people, meaning all groups of people in the Indian society, was actually not that representative to them. And they certainly found that, in the name of jati, in the name of their own caste, they could actually generate a sort of a sense of communitarian identity. And this communitarian identity actually emerged in the late years of the 19th century, but more so with the depressed class conferences and depressed class memorandums in the early part of the 20th century in all parts of India. And that actually laid the basis of this entire story that actually sometimes divides the Indian public, even in contemporary times, is as who is a national and who is an anti-national. Now, in most cases, the Congress, which was claiming to be the nationalist vanguard or the bandwagon, failed to accommodate the aspirations of the lower caste. As a result, many times, as M.S.S. Pandey and others have pointed out, these assertions were branded as anti-national, divisive, sectarian, breakaway movements, and so on and so forth.
Sir, do you think that as time went on in the 1920s and 30s, when Congress did address the issue of caste, to what extent did challenges thrown up by the lower caste assertions of the early 20th, and which continued till the mid-20th century, did these have direct influence on Congress addressing these issues on caste? Because in the initial period it did not. So.
Well, particularly after this the sort of acrimonious debates that actually brought the Congress at loggerheads with depressed class representatives in the roundtable conferences, and also with the sort of the acrimony or the bitterness that became visible with the promulgation of the Ramsay MacDonald's Communal Award of 1932, and Gandhi's immediate retaliation through a fast, through hunger strike. That actually threw up very, very different possibilities before the Congress leadership. The Congress could now sense that obviously they could not shy away from addressing the caste issues or having their own strategies that would actually gain for them new converts from the depressed communities. And while there was one particular program which Gandhi devised, that was through the All India Harijan Sevak Sangh, activities which were channelized by Gandhi with the support of men like A.V. Thakkar Bappa, as he is known, and several other people. Even one can think of P. Ramamurthy, who later became a very famous communist leader, who was Gandhi's ardent supporter at one length of time and was very much involved with the Harijan Sevak Sangh. So there were innumerable number of people who were engaged with this sort of social reconstruction project that Gandhi envisaged through the Harijan Uplift program. But there were many other congressmen who actually felt that, of course, temple entry was creating a lot of debate where Gandhi himself was being involved. The Congress leadership was involved, like Rajagopalachari and several others. but these were at the but these leaders actually are a different set of leaders because they are visible at the national or at the pan-Indian level. But there are leaders who are local level managers of the Congress in the rural localities or in the semi-urban spaces which are abundant in India in the 1930s and even in the 1940s. And there we find that several people who later came up the rungs of the Congress and became very, very famous, prominent provincial Congress leaders like Satyamurthy, for that matter, in Madras. They took up yet another series of rural reconstruction projects, which really did not always depend on whether Gandhi sanctioned these projects or not. It happened in Bengal also, with several congressmen in Borishal, in Faridpur, taking up projects within the Navashintru community on their own. And certainly this section of Congress, which was more geared towards a people's Congress, and many of them later, many of them were also countering the prospects of a takeover of the Congress by the socialists. They had friends who were socialists. Of course, they did not have very good relations with the socialists, but even since they were also being pushed to one corner by the socialists, they also felt that the Congress should have a more representative character. And certainly people like Satyamurthy and several others in India, in different parts of India, actually do this in 1937 elections, when they actually take up people from communities which might not have been classified as depressed, but nonetheless backward, and also actually create a space whereby a section of the depressed class elites, a section of the depressed class elites and their followers could actually think of joining the Congress and voting for the Congress in the near future. Even if it was very small in terms of number, as Ambedkar later said that we actually won in all the primary elections, and when we went for the secondary tier, it was the upper caste people who defeated our candidates. Even if there is much truth in Ambedkar's assertions, but it doesn't rule out that the Congress in the 1920s and 30s didn't have its own project of rural reconstruction or a social reordering. This is quite contrary to what you've asked in terms of the early 20th century approach.
Was Gandhi's defense of the caste system an extension of similar defense of caste system by the 19th century intellectuals, or was it influenced by something else?
Well, Gandhi for that matter was less esoteric when it comes to the intellectual concern. When it comes to intellectual concerns about caste, I would say that, but Bankim and Vivekananda were, esoteric in the sense, or several others of their generation in different parts of India, because essentially they were trying to take up the Hindu texts, and also they were trying to take up these Western philosophers and the Western philosophies, But Gandhi actually was one who was trying to take up caste as he had understood from his childhood, because he had himself been born into a very conservative Baniya family and raised with all these ideas of purity, pollution, and this Gandhi's vocabulary, particularly a term bhangi itself, showed that Gandhi was addressing caste in a different way. Where Gandhi differed is that the 19th century intellectuals were simply more engaged in a sort of an intellectual pursuit of defending or bringing out faults with the caste system. Gandhi was a politician in that sense, though he also wrote volumes and tomes in the forms of letters or memorandums and so on and so forth. But Gandhi, as a political strategist here, is quite different when it comes to his own understanding of caste. He begins with a very, very, oft-repeated, version of caste, Chaturvarna, as Gandhi began. Then he said that caste there was nothing high or nothing low. Even this was something reminiscent of the 19th century. The Brahmins had one set of occupations, and the Bhangi had another set of occupations, and there was nothing impure attached to these occupations they were doing, and this is how the Indian society had functioned. The distribution of rewards and goods and entitlements had functioned on the basis of the Chaturvarna system. But then Gandhi, when he faces this Pune Pact and so on and so forth, he admits that untouchability is a blot on the Hindu caste system. The Hindu caste system is different from untouchability, and it should be, all these forms of discrimination should be removed. And Gandhi takes a much more practical or an action-oriented approach, because Gandhi's Harijan Sevak Sangh directly has one particular aspect which might have raised eyebrows even in the 1930s for that matter, because Gandhi's fast ended sometime late in September 1932, and in early October or late September in Bengal there was the Durga Puja, and Gandhi insisted that, and many of the Bengal Gandhians insisted, who were part of the Bengal Congress, insisted that we should have interdining. And interdining was a concept which had not been forced such vigorously in the Bengali psyche before. Obviously, and also entry of people into the Kalighat temple. The entry of people of all sections of society into the Kalighat temple has still not happened today. Officially.
Yeah.
Unofficially, people might have intruded
But I think in the Jagannath temple of Puri, Gandhi did a satyagraha, and
yes, it was opened up to the public. But what really happened is that when the interdining took place, a lot of people who were very enthusiastic were organizing all this. A lot of people within the depressed class, they said that we don't share our plates, or we don't partake food in a space where it is inhabited by other depressed classes. So there were counter stories of discrimination, exclusion, and one being higher than the other. And also a lot of upper caste people resented the fact that interdining was unacceptable. This was always the problem with the Gandhian approach, that there were several people who were being drawn towards Gandhi, and there were others who were, rejecting. And Gandhi at some times did vent his frustrations. It's very, very clear that even in the 1930s, he was talking about change of heart. There was no other politician who had talked about caste, who had walked for caste, who had, visited the Harijan hamlets, which had seen the worst forms of carnage, for example, in Madurai and so on and so forth. But certainly in 1940s, he's a very, very different man. He's not only a man who, in present times we are celebrating 75th year of the Quit India. He's just not only a man who is talking of karenge ya marenge, but also he is a man who realizes that ultimately Gandhi feels that caste has to be removed, that you cannot have the caste system. So that itself is a sort of an attack on the Hindu order, because Ambedkar said that you cannot have Hindu religion without the Hindu caste system. This is something synonymous, as Ambedkar had pointed out. But Gandhi, many social theorists do not take into account that a few years before he died in 1946, Gandhi said that the worst has come to our light, and we have been exposed to this. So I think better is that the best way that we reconcile these differences and move towards a common human existence is by intermarriage. So Gandhi did, so this journey from interdining to intermarriage is a journey that Gandhi goes through a very tortuous path, and it is not something that Gandhi gets the wholehearted support of the congressmen.
How can one explain the relative silence of caste issues in Bengal, even by the communists in the 1940s, even at the time when caste became a clinching issue, as he was saying that Gandhi even in 1942 and 46 was addressing caste. So was it typical of Bengal, or was it happening in other places of India? In South India, caste issues were being addressed at that point of time. Did the communists play a role in that? But they did avoid caste issues being addressed in Bengal.
Well, this is an aspect of India's past or India's present when one sees the left liberal discourse. By now the left discusses caste and this entire issue of exclusion of any form in myriad ways. The left counter-public is replete with this caste story and so on and so forth. But in the 1930s and 40s, when the Communist Party was a fledgling unit, the Communist Party was a fledgling unit. It was definitely sometimes fledgling, sometimes mass-oriented. Most of the leaders of the Congress actually happened to be upper caste or Brahmins, for that matter. And there was this entire logic because they were following this very laid down policy from Moscow or from any other communist leaders who were based in other parts of the world, that we had to have a class oriented approach. And there were many leaders in the Communist Party who believed that in some way or the other, caste and class sometimes overlapped, and they felt that class had to be given more importance in the terms of, they were looking into it in terms of material disparity and so on and so forth. The communist message definitely was well received even in the depressed class circles. We find that Tebhaga, for that matter, there was considerable participation from the depressed classes. In the Adiyar movement also, where we find the depressed classes went. For example, in Tanjore, they went to the Pallar and the Parayar communities and they got the support. But the problem with the Indian communists was that by privileging on class, they were totally abrogating yet another social distinction or caste as an agency of social divisions. And here, caste actually had stored up a whole lot of issues which were not addressed when you take up class as one way of addressing social maladies. Because caste conjures within it 100 or 1,000 forms of emotions. Caste also determines levels of exclusion which are absent when you take class together. And Dalit masses, particularly in India, in the 1930s and 40s, they had their own sense of grievances. Possibly, this entire story of revolution, of a red flag fluttering in their hamlets was not only one particular concern. There were very, very different concerns of their sensibilities being, soothed, because of this repeated upper caste violence and the repeated upper caste ascendancy. Even in this land question, when the communists actually went into the redressal of land question, which was a big issue in the 1930s and 40s, obviously they were guided more because their supporters mostly came from what India today sees as the OBC categories. And himself and a communist leader of no less a caliber of E.M.S. Nambudripa actually cautioned the communists. They believed that people like E.M.S. Nambudripa were cautioning the communist cadre that till this period of time, we are only running up to people who have 5 acres of land. Basically, the typically intermediary middle peasant category. We are actually not looking into this huge group of agricultural laborers. So, this is the reservoir of humanity which should give us strength in the future days. And that has really not happened because communist leaders continued to betray caste sentiments. And this was very pejoratively put forward by Selig Harrison in India, The Most Dangerous Decades, when he talks about the situation in Andhra between the communist leadership divided between the two big communities of Kammas and Kapus.
Do you think that caste played any role in the rehabilitation of partition victims in Bengal in 1947?
Yes, of course. Caste once again came out in the aftermath of partition, or in the sort of the reconstruction of Bengal, so as to say, after the war and the partition in the early 1940s. And there also is a very, very familiar story of caste being pushed aside, and people who had been running away from Eastern Bengal districts and being accommodated or not being accommodated, even in their living in very, very deplorable state or conditions in the refugee camps. There also we find that there is a very, very different story as to what historians are now commenting, because the upper caste group still had some bit of money. They might have had some familial contacts with the western districts, people in Calcutta or in its neighborhood, and more so since they were materially better off, and they were not only they had the material advantage, they also had the social capital of being upper caste, of being well connected or interlinked, and also the cultural capital in terms of education. So, in the government scheme, they are the first people to be accommodated, because you don't have that form of reservation system in the late 1940s or early 1950s. So the government jobs, which are basically the white collar jobs, which the new nation state creates and the provincial units also follow. There you find that mostly it is the Bengali Bhadralok class who have been displaced from Eastern Bengal, who actually sit in the big halls of the dead writers building as babus or clerks. But there is very few references of people of lower caste or Dalit background having that sort of fortune, or being so fortunate, getting patta lands or getting closer to Calcutta in terms of government housing societies and so on and so forth. So they continue to stay in the shanties, they continue to languish in Cooper's camp, they continue to languish in the camps which are quite far away from Calcutta proper, Ranaghat for that matter, or Nodia for that matter, or other parts of Nodia for that matter. And there actually we find that even in the refugee camps or settlements, the upper castes are given a better space. They are usually in one part of the camp where there is the water supply is better, when there is less problem when it comes when it comes to the rainy season. There is less of inundation and so on and so forth. But when you see how caste operates in terms of mind, in terms of the government mind, the Dalit groups are usually pushed to the less favored areas of the camp, as what Shekhar Bandyopadhyay and others have to say. So this Dalit perception about partition itself is a matter of guilt and shame for the enlightened, I think for the enlightened middle class in India, because the Dalits sometimes they would argue that we are neither you, meaning the Hindus, and neither they, meaning the Muslims. We had always been different from you. Why do you butcher us, and why do you throw us into this sort of a situation? Because we are not accustomed to this sort of society. We have always been somewhere or the other, being subservient to you, dependent on you for our daily livelihood. So this question, of course, the upper class did face this question of a very uncertain future and livelihood. For the Dalit masses, it was more, because partition robs them of all the benefits of their patrons. And this has been very well pointed out in the case of Punjab.
Yeah.
And the same sort of story is very much there in Bengal. And it continues to be so till about 1960s and 70s, when they actually then, from a casteist paradigm, they move into the class paradigm, which is their preferences for the left in Bengal.
How did the post-colonial state deal with caste in the initial years of independence?
Well, the post-colonial state in the years immediately after independence did come up with some of these provisions in the constitution, guaranteeing equality to all classes of citizens, making certain offences like not allowing people to come into a restaurant, or not even not being allowed to courts or other government offices, a serious offence. And then there were these various proclamations about temple entry and so on and so forth. But that caste could actually justify both material and social deprivation. That itself was never high in the agenda of the post-colonial state. And perhaps here we would find that the post-colonial state continued to betray a sense of upper caste hegemony. And the upper caste elites failed to realize that, that caste system, in the way that Gandhi had looked onto the caste system from a very practical approach, that they needed a very, very practical approach towards the understanding of caste and to actually eliminate caste. So once again there was inertia when it came to matters related to expansion of education of scheduled castes, matters relating to the building of hostels for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, and also providing ample employment opportunities. And what essentially the post-colonial state in these initial years remained was a sort of a preserve of upper caste monopoly. But then in course of time, Nehru's policies did change. It's not to say that the post-colonial state hung on to what it perceived to be right in the late 1940s and believed that the same would be there in the late 1950s. Because by the late 1950s, we find that Nehru's administration had also started talking about caste. And there was this belief that once we modernize, the problem with Nehruvian policy was that it was heavily, leaning itself on this modernization drive. I believe that once we modernized and once we set up these multi-purpose projects, once we had more of government funding for public sector and so on and so forth, caste problems would be answered. Now, this was definitely one major response. But the other major response became clear in the 1960s, that what the Indian elite defined as one way of eliminating the sort of caste differences, caste divisions, and the sort of exclusion and seclusions that were associated with it. It really was a modernist concern which was there within a section of the Indian intelligentsia or the political circles or the bureaucracy. It never permeated to the grassroots where people talked about jati, caste in a very different way. And this is very true if one reads these early American anthropologists who came to India, right from people like David Mandelbaum to Milton Singer and so on and so forth. Almost everyone have alluded to this, even the Rudolphs have alluded to it. So we would find that the people below, they still believed that this sort of jati structure had a lot of problems. And Nehru's ideas or the Congress's ideas certainly didn't take into account these jati ideas that were prevalent in the countryside. As a result of it, you see a new rural social movement emerging in the 1960s, whether it is Chaudhary Charan Singh's movement of the Jat, of the agricultural communities, or whether you see Karpuri Thakur and people like Ram Manohar Lohia, for that matter. Lohia had a big take on caste in the 1960s. So that is very, very different from this Nehru's top-bottom approach, very westernized thinking about that caste would dissipate. Rather, this was a much more indigenist or a desi version of how caste operated, what are the maladies of caste, and what are even the potentialities through which a jatis could organize themselves into political units.
The last question in this session. So, what is the role of caste in the present day electoral politics in India? And related to this is, do you think that caste is still avoided to be addressed in the politics of West Bengal?
Yeah, when one takes India as a whole in the last 20-25 years, I think, particularly after the Mandal Commission reports came out, the sort of euphoria over the report, and the equally a sort of the dampening effect that one saw immediately in the post-Mandal days through self-immolations of students, university campuses, rocked by violence and so on and so forth. But certainly we would find that, caste became very, very important. And many politicians realized that caste was not only a divisive force, but caste was also a force that could be used against the rising tide of communalism in the 1990s, the post-Babri Masjid period also. So people like Mulayam Singh Yadav and others, came to use caste as a platform, as a rallying point, using slogans such as Pichre Varg and Anusuchit Jati and so on and so forth to rally the Indian masses. And
also
certainly
Mayavati.
Also Mayavati in the late 1990s, this Dalit program, and Mayavati was preceded by the BAMSF movement of Kasi Ram and so on and so forth. So caste definitely became an important agency through which the electorate behavior of the Indian masses could be gauged and could be actually even transferred in real terms into votes. And that has been there right down to present times, that we see that caste does play a very important role. Sometimes caste gets submerged within other issues when the electorate considers of electing a particular party or actually throwing a party or a regime out of power. But nonetheless, caste continues. Sometimes it is quite visible visible before us. Sometimes it operates more as a subterranean entity. In the case of Bengal, we find that obviously people like Ras Malik, who were very much debunked by the Bengali communists, had argued that it was basically the left rule was basically a rule which had seen a combination of the three traditional Bengali upper castes, the Brahmins, Castos and Boitos. So there was no difference. And still Brahmins predominated in terms of ministerial berths, in terms of positions in the party hierarchy and the party officers and so on and so forth. The left actually, in its long rule of 34 years, actually didn't really take up caste as a whole. They tried to argue rather indirectly or directly. There was a belief that class politics would actually address caste politics, which was quite contrary to the case, because class politics, if the left had any advantage altogether, was only from the ranks of the OBCs, because the left had a huge number of middle-level district leaders who came from the ranks of the OBCs, the typical peasant communities. But beneath that, when it came to communities which were neither OBCs, which were Dalit communities, or communities which were neither OBCs nor Dalits, but considered to be rather low in the rural social hierarchy, there the left did not really penetrate. There, I think the left only went through with these very old dictums of rationing system, granting some bit of patta, and so on and so forth. And that too, as many, development study scholars in Kerala have also pointed out, that we give this to you as a form of a gratis. If one reads people like J. Devika and others, we give it to you as a form of a gratis. You accept our leadership, we give it back to you. So this sort of mentality also reinforced a new sense of casteism within the very approach of the left. And possibly, this sort of not knowing the Indian Republic as it existed at the subaltern level really cut the left's feet from the soil. So it had no foothold on the soil of Bengal, and as a result of which, right from 2008 onwards, when these rural insurrections started in Nondigram or in Shingur, the left might have defined these as Fisiperas, as anti-national movements like the Namoshudros, the Rajbongshi movement, certainly the Kantapuri agitations. These once again surfaced, and now because since the state machinery, the party machinery and the state machinery, which at one length of time had looked to be one and the same, was losing its ground, once again caste became a major issue. And at least till present day, we find that continues to have a sway over 70 or 80 seats in the West Bengal Legislative Assembly. So caste has come out from its subterranean level, and now it is like a hungry serpent, looking at its adversaries.